few years ago, I was vicar of a really tough parish in East London, and it was tough. There was a lot of violence, drugs, gang activity, and major social problems. In fact, it was such a rough area that I had barbed wire around my whole vicarage, and I had panic buttons in every room in the house. And one day, the doorbell went, and I went to answer the door, and John was standing there. Now, I knew John. I knew him quite well. He was an alcoholic in the parish, and he was quite a nice guy when he was sober, but he really wasn't a nice guy when he was drunk. And on that day, he was drunk. He was very drunk. And before I could greet him, he pushed past me and he walked into the kitchen, and I followed him, and he pulled out a knife on me and told me to sit down. And for the next half an hour, he was waving the knife in my face, ranting and raving about how God had destroyed his life and destroyed him, and how he was going to kill me because he wished he could kill God instead. And after half an hour, my daughter, Rebecca, walked in from school. She was 7 at the time, and she knew John and very calmly saw what was going on. And she walked over to the food cupboard and offered John a packet of crisps, which he ate. And then she offered him a satsuma, which he ate. And then she said, "Will you let my daddy go, please?" And she took him by the hand and led him out of the front door. And as it closed behind us, we both burst into tears. Now, John hated God, and as a result of that, when he was that drunk, he hated me as well, and he wanted to take out all his hurt and his anger on me. And as a parish priest, as an ordinary Christian, how could I react to that level of animosity? Many of us have faced or will face real animosity as we stand firm in the faith. And how do we respond to that? Well, Peter speaks into that in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. And he begins with a very straightforward idea in verse 12. "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Peter is making a really pragmatic point here. Why should we be surprised when we face animosity from others because of our faith? After all, Jesus had predicted that this would happen. In Mark chapter 13, verse 9, Jesus had said, "They will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten, and they will bring you to trial." In Matthew 5, Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." No Christian in the early church was in any doubt that persecution or facing animosity was a likelihood for them. And you know what? We shouldn't be surprised either. And of course, Jesus himself was eventually killed for standing firm in the faith. So Peter has quite a pragmatic understanding of suffering for the faith. It had been predicted by Jesus. It had been modeled to us by Jesus. And so it was to be understood as part and parcel of being a Christian. Now, in this opening verse, Peter uses the phrase that this is a fiery ordeal that we go through when we face animosity for being a Christian. And that's a really interesting phrase, isn't it? And it's one that is used in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 21, as the method by which gold and silver are refined and tested. And there's a clear sense in which Peter understands the sufferings of Christians in this sense. It is one method by which our faith is tested, our endurance is tested. And that is so true for us, isn't it? Nothing tests our faith more than when we are mocked or ridiculed or misunderstood for the faith we hold. It is a test of endurance. And as we come through it, so we discover that our faith is made stronger, not weakened, because we are called upon to reassess exactly why we're a Christian and why we are determined to hold fast to the faith. I imagine that Jesus himself, as he was dying on the cross, was going through a time of self-reflection so that he could understand exactly why he was doing what he was doing, and reminding himself that even in this extreme moment of horror, his Father God was in control and the purposes of God were being fulfilled. And as he reflected on that, so his resolve to endure would have been strengthened. Well, when you and I face animosity from others because of our faith, we are inextricably linked to the suffering of Jesus on the cross. As Peter says in verse 13, but rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings. The suffering and passion of Christ has become for us a pattern of living. And as we follow his example, so we are united with Christ in his sufferings. And Peter says that we are to rejoice when we face animosity, not because we're seeking it out or that we have some sort of masochistic streak, but because we know that the joy to come from standing firm in our faith far outweighs the current negative experience. Perhaps we often wonder how the saints and martyrs were able to rejoice in the midst of their suffering. I mean, it seems like an all too superhuman thing to do, doesn't it? But Peter says that it is possible for all of us to be glad in the midst of suffering if we contextualize our current traumas in the light of that which is to come. Verse 13, rejoice so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. So when the second coming of Jesus happens, those who have been oppressed will be glad and will shout for joy. That's the hope that keeps the persecuted church going through their trials, and it's the hope that we must cultivate amongst ourselves so that if we are ever called to the fiery ordeal, we will not be found wanting. I was in India, in a very rural eastern region, training youth workers from India and also some others who were being brought in from Nepal. And I was in a small town where there was strong opposition to Christians, and the work I was doing was being kept very quiet. And somehow my presence leaked out, and some of the opponents of Christianity came to the house, and they stood outside and started throwing bricks and rocks at the house to intimidate me and get me to leave. And this went on for many hours, and then news came through that there was a death threat issued against me. So I had to be smuggled out and escape to another town elsewhere in the region. So as a missionary priest, as an ordinary Christian, how should I react to that level of animosity? Well, the first step to facing animosity, as we've seen, is to put it into context. The context of suffering with Christ, the context of the future glory which is ours if we stand firm and endure. The second step to facing animosity is to make sure that we are not aggravating the situation and making it worse by how we're behaving. It's a recurring theme throughout Peter's first letter that there is nothing inherently good about suffering in and of itself. Suffering is a neutral concept. There is nothing meritorious about suffering for the wrong thing. If we make wrong choices in life and suffer as a result, there is no merit with God in that. But if we suffer as a result of choosing to live in obedience to God, then there is merit with our Father in heaven. And Peter repeats that idea here in verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Now that seems like a bit of a bizarre list. It doesn't seem very coherent. It's almost as if Peter is plucking ideas from out of the air. Murderer, thief, criminal, mischief maker. But I think he's just drawing examples of some of the types of things that people suffer for. However, the interesting comment here is the word mischief maker. And I think that we do have something that we can take from that word. It's the only time that this word is found in the New Testament, and it doesn't appear to have been used in the Greek language before 1 Peter. And it's only used a few times in Christian writings after this letter. In fact, there's only 3 more usages of it in early Christian literature. And one of these was by Dionysius the Areopagite in the 5th century. And this is the only comparable usage with Peter's use of the word. And when Dionysius uses the word mischief maker, he is referring to bishops who meddle in the affairs of dioceses beyond their own. Bishops who don't know the boundary of their own authority and get involved in moralizing and influencing decisions in parts of the community that are beyond the boundaries of their own authority. This idea of a mischief maker is someone who meddles in things that are none of their business, particularly in the realm of moral values. And it seems that Peter and Dionysius are referring to people who see themselves as the guardians of moral values in society, when actually they have no right or authority to offer an opinion or seek to influence behavior. So I think that what Peter is saying here is that Christians need to recognize the boundaries of the Christian community and not try to legislate morality for others. Perhaps it's sometimes the case that we as Christians bring animosity upon ourselves by meddling in matters that don't rightfully come under our authority, and we expect non-Christians to live by the values that we want to push on them. Now, if we are not open to the sensitivities of those who don't follow the faith, according to Peter, they will rightfully get annoyed with us and show animosity towards us. So Peter is being pragmatic here and saying, don't just wind people up by asking them to sit under the tenets of the Christian faith when it's not something they profess to believe. And that goes for our interaction as a church with civil society, but it also goes for us as individuals within our families and amongst our friends who may not share our Christian faith. We need to be sensitive to others at all times. It was 33 AD. He was a carpenter in a little village in Palestine, and after plying his trade for 30 years, he suddenly started getting involved in religious and political life, healing the sick, raising the dead, proclaiming a new kingdom. And the people in power at the temple and in the Roman court saw him as a mischief maker and decided to get rid of him. So they mocked him and beat him and tortured him and crucified him. On a human level, he struggled with what was happening to him, and he shouted, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But then he was able to put all that hatred and all that animosity into its appropriate context, and he cried out to God, "It is finished. Into your hands I commend my spirit." And as a result of enduring his time of trial, the carpenter was glorified and welcomed into the presence of his Father and honored and adored for all eternity. Mocked, beaten, tortured, crucified, faced with the most horrendous, undeserved treatment that we can imagine. As ordinary Christians, how are we to react to that level of animosity? How are we to respond to the carpenter who endured so much on our behalf? Perhaps when animosity comes our way, we are to endure all things for him as he has endured all things for us. That is the context of our suffering. And in that context, when we face animosity, there's only one way we can possibly respond.